Hi folks, Ben here with part 2. Now in part 1 we looked at projection and pretty much every aspect of what you can control about projection. Part 2 is going to be using projection for a slightly different application. What we're going to do is we're going to take this tabletop that we cleaned up in part 1 and we're going to put a piece of chrome text on the table, and we're going to get the tabletop to be reflected in the chrome text exactly as it would be if it was actually standing on a tabletop. We're going to use projection for that, but we're going to use some other tools as well to sort of generally achieve some lighting and sort of organisational bits and bobs. Probably about 15 minutes, I would say. We'll rattle through it, and at the end of it, hopefully we'll have a relatively convincing chrome text sitting on this tabletop. Okay, so we start as we always start, pretty much by grabbing a bunch of these points from the 3D camera tracker's solve, and we say create a solid and a camera. And as you know by now, I like the solid to be black and I like it to be translucent so I can see what on earth is going on. And what I'll do is I'll just rotate that to line up nicely with the tabletop. Let's just move it there. Now in the past I've just been sort of resizing the layers like that lazily for speed. Actually the better thing to do is always to adjust the layer itself, just so you get the thing to the size that you want. I'm going to choose a frame to project at, probably something like that I would guess, around 420. Before I project this I'm going to use another script, because when After Effects creates these 3D camera solves, let me just come into the left view here so you can see. Here's our camera moving along, and After Effects isn't to know that this is a table and that tables are supposed to be flat and so on. It just solves the points. So what we've got is our table surface here. I've selected it there, and you can see that that is a pretty skewy table. It couldn't be like that, because if it was, all of this stuff would fall off it. But that's how After Effects has perceived the world. It doesn't know that that's a table like we do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my script, my forthcoming script actually, be out very soon, called 3D Rotation Pro. And what you do with this, you just select the solid that you want to be orientated in a certain way. You decide what you want it to be. We don't actually have the option table, but table, floor, you know, they're all in the same kind of plane. Hit auto. Decide where you want it to be centered, in this case the comp center. There's some other things you can do too, and then you hit align and you see that everything jumps so that you now got a table that's flat, aligned properly in the world. The camera is moving relatively, but from the camera's point of view everything has stayed exactly the same. So next up is the projection bit. We've already got our projection layer selected, so it's just a question of hitting go, and there it is, our projection. And the other element of course to this is the text itself. So if I just create a text layer, and we shall type in, not to, please turn over, projection, and we will make that 3D, and we'll shift parent it to the projection layer, and that just moves it into the same position in the same plane. And if we then unparent this, and this is the joy of the world being the right way up, we set it to 0, 0, 0, we have a piece of text standing on the table, and you can see it's standing on the table because I can sink it in like that. I'm going to lift it actually up a couple of pixels from the table surface, because that just will create a nicer shadow underneath it and give it a bit of separation from the table when we get to that point. The first thing I need to do though is to give it some geometry. So if I give it about 70 extrusion and give it a level of 3 or so, and I'm going to give it the material options of a shiny piece of chrome. That means reflection intensity 100, that means specular intensity 100. Ambient and diffuse get overridden by the reflection intensity, so we can actually turn both of those down to 0 without worrying too much about it. You don't have to. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to make sure this casts shadows as well. Okay. We are going to want that to reflect the table surface, so we also need to make sure that the table surface appears in reflections. That's on now, and we've obviously got something missing, and I suspect it's the good old-fashioned metal setting. What the metal setting does, it multiplies the reflection of the specular by the original colour of the layer. Now the original colour of the layer in this instance is black, so those things multiplied by black just make black, and If we turn the metal right down to 0, you see only reflection. If you turn it right up to 100, you see only black. And what I'm actually going to do is just put it around 33, so we see a bit of reflection in there. Very good. What are we missing? We're missing some lighting. Now, let's just come into the custom view over here. And this is the joy, once again, I can't stress enough how great it is to have your world the right way up. You can just come in, you can move around, there's your camera, there's your tabletop, it's all set up. And even there, just looking at that, I can see straight away that our projection's a bit rubbish. That we need to just actually get rid of these. Oh, I do it every time. Creating a shape layer. A mask is what I want to create, one of those, and that can be a subtractive mask, and up here as well we can just get rid of that corner so that we're getting pure tabletop projected. That's what we want. And both of those can just be eased off with a bit of a feather. Looking good. So there we go. What we need is a window. If I just come back to the active camera again, you can see that in the original we've got sort of soft shadows that are being thrown in this sort of direction, from right to left. So the window is actually somewhere about here in the original shot. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to create a window, and we're going to make a kind of softbox type of light, a soft shadow casting light. And to do that, we're going to use my other script, Illumination. Now, what I'm going to need first up is, let's come to that custom view again. I'm going to need a solid layer. I'm going to make it white, and I'm going to make it 750 by 1500, so it's kind of quite a lot taller than it is wide, and we'll call that window. That's 3D. There it is in the middle of the scene, and I'm going to just grab that and shift it over there. But let's zoom out just a touch. Bring the window over there, even a bit further, and we'll lift it up in the air a bit where it belongs, and we'll spin it around 90 degrees. And I think that's probably just about where the window was in the shot. If we come around to here, what I might also do is just sort of move it forwards a bit so it tends to throw the shadow backwards. Maybe we'll even scale it up just a touch, something like that. And then we come up to illumination and we set the spacing between the lights. I'm going to give it about 18 lights and make sure they cast shadows. Here we've got a 3x6 grid, and I just hit go. And as you can see, bingo, we've got a 6x3 grid of lights. I'm going to hit shy just so I don't have to look at those all the time on the timeline. And I'm actually going to turn the old window back up, and I'm going to just change its settings so that it doesn't accept lights and shadows, it doesn't cast shadows, and that it does appear in reflections, which we already have, so that it's actually going to be seen reflected in this text, as well as creating the light that shades the text. So back to our active camera, we should now see, yep, shaded text, indeed we do. We're not seeing any shadows cast at the moment because, presumably, we're not accepting shadows down here. So if we just hit accept lights and accept shadows, pow, nothing. Well, that's because of the settings that get used when a projection layer is created. They're basically created to not be lit. Because if you imagine when you project on, you're actually getting a ready lit surface projected. You don't want to light it again from After Effects. And to do this reflection stuff, we're basically saying, okay, After Effects, light it again. So we need to go and set a few things. And the reason we're not seeing anything there is because the diffuse is set to 0. If we just turn that up to 50, then we'll see some of that lighting. Not very strongly, but we can see it. And that means that when I come up and change the illumination settings, all of those lights that were created are controlled centrally from this window layer now. I can turn that up to like 300. And hey presto, you can start to see the shading on there. What I'm going to do actually in this scene as well is just to create an ambient light, and we'll give it about 33 intensity, something like that. And that should just do the rest. Let me just change its name to ambient, like that. I'm also going to come into the shadow darkness controller of window and just turn that up to about 100, like that. And I'm going to turn the diffusion up just to melt those shadows together into one sort of soft shadow. And you can see immediately we're getting something that's kind of believable in terms of the shading. What unfortunately isn't believable is the fact that you can now see the projection surface because we've lit it. We've essentially double lit it. It had its original lighting, and now it's got some After Effects lighting in there as well. So we're going to have to think of a way around that. The way is to basically duplicate up this layer. I'm going to make this to be called reflection. I'm going to make sure by changing the material options that it only appears in the reflections. Now, it's still shaded, it's still shadowed, it's still lit and everything like that. And all of that stuff appears in the reflections. It's just that the layer itself doesn't appear. And that means that we can see the tabletop exactly as it was intended through that layer. The only problem is we've lost the shadows. So what I'm going to do now is to create a duplicate of that layer. I'm going to call it shadow. And I'm going to come into the material settings again. And I'm going to turn the appears and reflections off, bringing us back to that. And then I'm going to change cast the accept shadows to only. And that makes it essentially into a shadow catcher layer. And you can see the problem with the shadow catcher layer, that it tends to, when you're using lots and lots of lights, it tends to make a very, very dark shadow. Now fortunately you can actually control that by changing the opacity of the shadow layer. That acts as a kind of multiplier, and you can see that as I drag that around, that's just sort of bringing the shadows down to something much more believable. So there we are at 9%. If I bring it down to say sort of 6 or something like that, then we're getting quite a nice level of shadowing there. It's a bit darker than what's going on behind. That's okay for the moment. But yeah, I can live with that. That's good. Once we've got our shadow in place, then we can come back to our window, for instance, and we can sort of start to lift it up, and we can sort of just see what shadow it's casting. We can perhaps just come and move it a little bit once again further forwards to throw that shadow backwards a touch. Lift it up a little bit so it doesn't go too far off the edge of the table. Just sort of intensified it there, and that means that we could perhaps do with just turning the old shadow darkness down a little bit. I don't want to get it, I'm just getting everything broadly into the right zone at the moment, and that seems to be just about doing it. Now, generally speaking, I would probably create another softbox in this particular comp just to create a bit more of an ambient occlusion style shadow on the table. What I'm going to show you instead is a bit of a cheat. What I'm going to do is create a point light, and the point light is going to have an intensity of 1. It's going to not really do very much in the way of illuminating, but as you can see here, I've been creating one before. I'm going to give it a majorly big shadow darkness. I'll give it no diffusion to kick off with, and we'll just OK that, and I'll shift jump that to the center of the text. When I lift that up in the air, as I'm about to do, I will in a second, I promise you. In fact, let's just sort of take that up to minus 1500 in Y. You can see that it's casting a nice little shadow down on the ground. Okay, it's a little bit big on this side. I might even just attempt to just shunt that over that way just a touch. And when I come into here and I turn the shadow diffusion up to something enormous, then it's just giving a kind of scattered little shadow underneath the text that feels a bit like ambient occlusion. It's a bit of a cheat. I told you it was a bit of a cheat, but for our purposes here, it will do the job. Let's just turn that down a bit because it's a touch over the top, I'd have to say. And that's beginning to feel quite sort of believable. I'm just tempted to turn the darkness down here a little bit. I'm going to deliberately leave it up a bit to just give a real sort of sense of it being there. I'm not going to worry too much just a moment about it sort of matching there. It's a demo, you can do all that sort of stuff later. But there you go, we've definitely got a piece of text, and it definitely feels as though it's sitting on the table there, doing its thing, whatever shiny text does. Okay, now there's a couple of little things that we could also throw in there just for fun. The reflection up here is of a white ceiling, and at the moment we're seeing black on the top of the text. I think that's quite nice, but let's just sort of create a quick ceiling layer, shall we? We'll call it ceiling, and we'll make it 1500 by 1500, white, 3D, and I'm going to shift jump it once again to this part of the table. I'm going to lift it up in the air. Hello. I've got to deparent it first, and then lift it up in the air. like that. Let's lift it quite high. And I'm going to come in and just look at its material settings and just make sure that it does indeed appear in reflections. In fact, we can have it only appear in reflections, but I don't want it to react to light. I just want it to have its natural white colour without reflecting any kind of illumination in the scene. And it doesn't cast shadows, that's good. We're not seeing it in the reflections yet, presumably because it's a bit too small. So let's just make it massive. There we go. Just scaled it up to nearly 1000%, and there you can see it's reflected. Now that's a bit much. We could then just say colour correction, tint, and if we tint that white value to a, I don't know, sort of lowish grey, then we're suddenly getting a kind of greyish reflection on the top of the text instead of that black that we had before, and that's just a little bit more believable in the context of the room here. The last thing that I'd like to do is to just perhaps, I'm thinking with the ambient light, if I was to turn that a little bit yellowish, that it might just sort of warm that reflection up slightly. Did that do something? I'm not quite sure. But also to come into here and actually to use that metal thing that I was talking about at the start, just to generally adjust the kind of brightness of the reflection. We had it at 33. I think I'm going to just nudge it down a little bit to 40 or so, like that. And as a last thing, I still think that those shadows are perhaps just a little bit on the heavy duty side. The thing is, I like how they affect the text, the shading on the text. So what I'm going to do, I think, is just keep that up there at about 70 or something like that. And for this short demo, I'll live with the slightly too heavy shadows going on there. Okay, that's about it. Once you've done that, you probably want to come in and switch into some evening wear with a ray tracing quality of 5. Or even 8, or 12, or 16, or however many you want to go, however much time you've got to render it. I'll stick the old motion blur on there, and it's okay. There's more you could do with that. There's other places you could take it, but for the 15 minutes or so we've spent on it, that's not a bad start. Let's give a little RAM preview and finish off with that. Well, there you have it. One piece of shiny text that says projection sitting on a table in front of some old camera equipment. Just what you always wanted. My name's Ben. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I hope it's been informative. Thanks for listening.